Since their 2009-10 Stanley Cup Finals loss to the Chicago Blackhawks, the Philadelphia Flyers have made the playoffs 6 times. In the past 10 seasons, the team has only advanced out of the first round once. The Flyers, throughout their organization's history, have been one of the NHL's premier clubs. That hasn't been the case as of late. With another big front office change on the way, let's take a look into the recent history of the Philadelphia Flyers, an organization that has had a massive fall from grace, but yet may finally have legitimate hope for the future. Since 2010, the Flyers have had 3 full-time general managers. The first was Paul Holmgren, who served from 2006 to 2014. He gave up that title when he was promoted to the president of the organization and remains a key part of the club's infrastructure today. The next GM was Ron Hextall. Hextall's Flyers were kind of all over the place. The team was young and had plenty of talent, but wasn't in a position to contend or rebuild. In his second full season in charge of the team, Hextall's Flyers made the playoffs, thanks in large part to an incredible rookie season from defenseman Shane Gostisbehere. The Capitals, their first-round opponent, eliminated them in 6 games. At this point, team stars Claude Giroux, Jacob Voracek, and Wayne Simmons were entering their prime years. At the same time, a crop of young players were coming up in the system, including Gostisbehere, along with Scott Laughton and Ivan Provorov, and more. Hextall didn't commit to helping the Stars, and the Flyers finished the next season in a mediocre 19th place league-wide. In the off-season, Hextall traded star forward Brayden Schenn for 2 first-round picks and Jori Lehtera, a trade that brought good value back to the Flyers, but didn't seem to fit with the Giroux, Voracek, Simmons timeline. The next year, the Flyers made it back to the playoffs off of the back of an 102-point season from Claude Giroux. They were again eliminated within 6 games, this time by the Pittsburgh Penguins. In the off-season, Hextall handed out a $35 million deal to James Van Riemsdyk, making a move that signified intent to contend. After making this move, expectations for the Flyers were high. The team had just made the playoffs and then added the second most expensive UFA of that year to the roster. The team needed immediate success, and they didn't get that. After a disastrous start to the year, both Ron Hextall and head coach Dave Hakstol were let go. Hextall's tenure was one of inaction, of refusal to build a contending team around the team's stars while they were firing at their heights. To his credit, it at least seemed like he had stocked the cupboards well for the future of the organization, with Travis Konecny, Travis Sanheim, Nolan Patrick, and Carter Hart among others all stepping up at the NHL level in the 2018-19 season. Hextall had certainly made his mistakes, but given the position he left the Flyers in, there was plenty of value to be extracted from the organization. Only 1 week after Hextall was officially let go, the Philadelphia Flyers named their next general manager. Former Minnesota GM Chuck Fletcher took over the reins on December 3, 2018. During his 9-season tenure in Minnesota, Fletcher had built a consistent playoff team. The Wild were always able to make the playoffs but never advance past the second round. In Philadelphia, Fletcher was expected to do what Hextall didn't, that being contend and win. In his first off-season, it's clear that Fletcher's Flyers were trying to be a competitive team. In a 3-month span, Fletcher arguably made more moves of significance than Hextall did throughout his entire tenure. First, he picked up the team's new head coach, bringing in Alain Vigneault in April of 2019. Then, prior to and during the free agency period, the team made 3 notable additions. First, the team traded a 5th-round pick to the Jets for Kevin Hayes' signing rights. The team then signed him to a 7-year $50 million contract, making a huge commitment to the player they hoped would be the 2C behind Couturier. Fletcher then sought out to fill another need and went after 2 right-handed defensemen. The Flyers flipped Radko Gudas for Matt Niskanen, and 4 days later, traded a 2nd and 3rd-round pick to San Jose for Justin Braun. With the major holes in the roster addressed, the Flyers entered the 2019-20 season with the expectation of being a playoff team. This was undoubtedly the peak of the Fletcher-era Flyers and was their best season by far in recent history. Hayes and Braun did well in their first years with the club, but it was Matt Niskanen that proved to be the best acquisition by Fletcher. Niskanen and Provorov, while playing alongside each other, elevated each other to becoming top pairing defensemen. Along with what looked to be a deep forward group and solid goaltending from Carter Hart, the Flyers approached the playoffs as legitimate cup contenders. Under a different playoff format due to the shutdown season, the Flyers were placed in a round-robin tournament with the three other best teams in the East. The Flyers placed first in that tournament, winning out against Boston, Washington, and Tampa. In the first round matched against the 8th seed, Montreal made it a closer series than Philadelphia would have liked, but the Flyers took things in 6. The Flyers went out in the next round, dropping to the Islanders in 7 games. At season's end, there were plenty of reasons to be optimistic, but also some to be concerned about. The Flyers had surpassed all reasonable expectations and looked to be legitimate contenders. On the other hand, the team had struggled against a weak Montreal team, and while they took the Islanders to 7, the Flyers' 3 wins were all won in overtime. The team wasn't there yet, but it looked like they could be very soon. One day before the 2020 draft, the Flyers roster took a huge hit. Matt Niskanen, still only 33 years old, made the unexpected decision to retire from professional hockey. This was a huge blow to a team that had depended on him so heavily, and amid a time of uncertainty, Fletcher's team made no effort to fill the hole. The next season showed just how big of a loss it was, as the Flyers struggled immensely, missing out on a playoff spot. Carter Hart's struggles were particularly concerning. His save percentage dropped over 35 points, from a .914 to .877. To most after this season, the Flyers needed to be completely reevaluated. Many suspected that players like Carter Hart, Ivan Provorov, and Travis Konechny weren't actually as good as they were last year. Chuck Fletcher believed differently, and so he went into the off-season preparing to make some big swings. The summer of 2021 was the beginning of the end for Fletcher. First, the Flyers finally picked up their Niskanen replacement, moving out Nolan Patrick and Philippe Myers in exchange for Ryan Ellis. This move garnered tons of praise from the fans, as it looked like they had acquired a long-term top-pairing right defenseman at a cheap price. The next 2 moves were much more heavily scrutinized. In order to acquire another right defenseman, Fletcher first moved out Shane Gostisbehere, paying a 2nd and 7th round pick to Arizona to do so. Then, he spent a 1st round pick, 2nd round pick, and Robert Hagg to acquire Rasmus Ristolainen. In essence, the Flyers paid a 1st round pick, 2 seconds, a 7th, Shane Gostisbehere, and Robert Hagg in order to add Rasmus Ristolainen to their roster. This was, by far, Fletcher's most hated move, as it was almost universally scrutinized. Fletcher wasn't done yet. He then traded Jacob Voracek for Cam Atkinson 1-for-1. And, after remodeling much of the roster, the Flyers tied down the important pieces, re-signing Carter Hart, Travis Sanheim, Joel Farabee, and most importantly, Sean Couturier, who was given an 8-year, $62 million deal. Couturier's extension stood out as another questionable move, as he was expected to be a top trade deadline chip should the Flyers continue to slump in the standings the following year. With an 8-year deal in place now, though, the Flyers had no other choice. They were all in on trying to contend now. Except, yet again, the team fell flat. Ryan Ellis and Sean Couturier were unlucky to suffer season-ending injuries very early on, and head coach Alain Vigneault was fired. Only months after going all in on moving away draft picks and young players for veteran talent, the Flyers were forced into the position of deadline sellers and forced into selling franchise superstar Claude Giroux. Giroux was shipped to Florida, with key returning pieces including Owen Tippett and Florida's 2024 first. The Flyers finished a season in which they were trying to contend 4th last in the NHL. Fletcher had been in charge of the team for 4 seasons. 3 of them were mediocre to abysmal years in which the Flyers missed the playoffs. One of them was a solid year, where the Flyers looked like legitimate contenders. He believed the latter to be the real Flyers even still, and again, treated the offseason as if the Flyers were a contending team. After an extensive search, John Tortorella was brought in to be the new Flyers head coach. With Ryan Ellis seemingly done as a Flyer, Fletcher went out and got another right defenseman, trading for Tony DeAngelo. He also made probably his most confusing move, signing enforcer Nick Delorier to a 4-year deal. All of these moves showed to fans that Fletcher and the Flyers were completely out of touch with reality. They believed the team to be a contender, while pretty much everybody saw things differently. Unsurprisingly, 2022-23 has been another disastrous season. Nobody was surprised when the Flyers, once again, proved themselves to be a bottom 5 to bottom 10 team. Anger begun to turn into complete disinterest and abandonment of the team. Going into the 2023 trade deadline, Fletcher finally acknowledged that the team needed to rebuild while refusing to use the term rebuild. During the deadline, Fletcher failed to trade the most valuable expiring contract on the roster, that being James Van Riemsdyk. That was the final straw, as the fanbase's anger reached a new level to the point that ownership was finally pushed to fire Chuck Fletcher. So, what's next? For the time being, Danny Briere has been appointed as the interim GM of the Flyers, although it seems very likely that he's going to be the permanent GM in the near future. Briere has already openly admitted that he feels the Flyers need to rebuild, and so under his leadership, the Flyers may finally be going in the direction that fans have wanted for years. Additionally, the Flyers have announced that they'll be hiring a president of hockey operations, a position previously unstaffed as Fletcher held both positions. With these two hirings, Flyers management will have new blood in important places. The Philadelphia Flyers have been one of the league's most powerful franchises since entering the NHL in 1967. There's been a long history of ups, but as of late, it's almost been entirely downs. Ron Hextall refused to commit to big moves and froze team stars out of ever competing for anything during his tenure. Chuck Fletcher was willing to make the big moves, and even got the Flyers into a pretty good position in 2020. Unfortunately, he never gave up on the idea of the team being a contender, even long after he should have. Hope and optimism are at an all-time low as Danny Briere takes the temporary reins, but there is reason to be hopeful. The rebuild looks finally to be starting after more than a decade, and the Flyers are well situated to grab a top pick in the 2023 NHL Draft. The NHL is more fun when the Flyers are good, so here's hoping that they get there sooner rather than later.